Well, welcome back to our series, Marriage by Design. If you've got your Bible, turn to Mark chapter 10. We'll be there really quickly. Mark chapter 10 is going to be our text today. I want to welcome our Coweta campus, our Sapulpa campus, those of you that are watching online. I'm glad you've been along with us on this journey as we've talked about the fundamentals of marriage. We've really been focusing on the foundation. So week number 1, we talked about marriage being designed to be an exclusive relationship between a man and a woman. Right out of Genesis chapter 2, where God creates the female to complement and the male to complement the female. God designed marriage to be exclusively between a man and a woman. And why the Bible talks so much, gives us so much warning about protecting that relationship and the exclusivity of that marriage relationship. Week number 2, we talked about how marriage was designed to be in a principal relationship, that it was designed in such a way that the husband and wife, that's to be the principal, the primary relationship between the two of them. Genesis 2:24, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. And we talked about this complementary thing of both the leaving and the uniting, and that relationship is to be the primary, more important than any other relationship that exists, more important than anything. Nothing should get more of your time and energy and investment than your spouse. So this week we're going to look at Mark chapter 10, and we're going to talk about another foundation of this marriage relationship. In fact, it's right here that Jesus is teaching about marriage, but he's actually doing it while he's answering a question about divorce. And so that's the context, but Jesus then immediately launches into this, Mark chapter 10, verse 6. But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Well, that sounds interesting. It should, because that's a quotation from Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. Jesus actually is just quoting from the very beginning of the Bible. He had access to Genesis just like we do, and he's talking about how God made them male and female. Sounds an awful lot like what we discussed in week number 1 about the exclusive nature of marriage between a man and a woman. He goes on and says, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Wait a minute, that sounds really familiar. Well, it should, because Jesus is quoting Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Jesus is just quoting right out of the Bible as he had it. And let's just remember what we're talking about right here, this idea of leaving and being united, the idea of bonding together. That word actually is kind of this idea of being glued together, glued to something. And what we find out is for Jesus, this Genesis 2:24 was a fundamental verse. It was foundational to any of his teaching on marriage. Jesus uses that, and then look what he does after he quotes this particular verse. At the very end of verse 8, he says, so they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So they're no longer two, but they become one. What God has joined together, let no one separate. I want you to notice what I've got highlighted right there. God has joined together. Did you catch that? If you are married, if you are engaged to be married, if you think you might ever be married or married again someday, this is important for you. When a couple speaks their vows, when a couple comes together and take part in a marriage ceremony, it is not the bride, it is not the groom, it is not the parent, it is not the pastor who is the main player. According to Jesus, the main player is God. God is the one that does the joining together. God joins a husband and wife in one flesh. God does that. It's God that does the joining. And so Jesus' conclusion is what God has joined together, don't let anybody separate. In other words, don't try to unone what God has made one. It's the difference in what Timothy Keller in his book, The Meaning of Marriage, calls a consumer relationship versus a covenantal relationship. We all understand the idea of being a consumer. A consumer relationship lasts as long as the vendor meets your needs at a cost that's acceptable to you. And so if another vendor delivers better services at a better cost, you no longer have an obligation to that original relationship. In a consumer relationship, an individual's needs are more important than the relationship. Our Western culture has really adopted that idea of a consumer and a consumer relationship. A covenantal relationship, on the other hand, is one that is a binding, has binding principles for us. In a covenantal relationship, the good of the relationship takes precedence over the immediate needs of the individual. An example of that would be a mother who gets nothing emotionally out of providing for her infant. Yet in that kind of relationship, which is so different than a consumer relationship, we still put a social stigma on someone who maybe gives up their baby because it's too hard or it's too unrewarding. That is the idea of a covenantal relationship versus a consumer relationship. And we see these covenant relationships throughout the Bible. In fact, we see lots of them that are horizontal relationship. They're among people, between people. We see an example of that in the Old Testament of David, who ultimately became King David, but David and his friend Jonathan. We see those kinds of horizontal covenant relationships between nations. But more prominently, we see vertical relationships or vertical covenant relationships. That's when God makes a covenant with a person, like Abraham, or when God makes a covenant with a family, or God makes a covenant with His people or an entire nation. And what we discover when we're talking about marriage is that it is deeply covenantal because it includes both the horizontal aspect and the vertical aspect. In fact, Malachi 2:14 talks of the wife of your marriage covenant. Proverbs chapter 2 verse 17 talks about a wayward wife who has left the partner of her youth, and it says she has ignored the covenant she made before God. And so marriage is very much this aspect of a covenant. And so because marriage is a horizontal and a vertical covenant relationship, to break faith with your spouse, to break a pledge to your spouse, is to break faith or to break a pledge with God at the same time. Now, this whole idea of a covenant, you may not have recognized this before, but it shows up in the wedding ceremony. You know, when the bride comes down that center aisle as a part of that ceremony, the ushers have already seated the bride and her family, bride's family and friends on one side, and the groom's friends and family on another side of the auditorium. And then the bride comes down this center aisle, and it is a covenant setting. In fact, listen to what Strong's Concordance defines a covenant as. It is a compact made by passing between pieces of flesh. And so what would happen is the priests of the Old Testament, when they were going to make an irrevocable promise, they would cut up an animal and they would put half on one side and half on the other side, and then they would walk between those pieces of meat and they would make their promises. And they were as much saying this: if I break this promise, may it be done to me as I have done to this animal. It was a binding covenant. No bailout, no temporary promise, no escape clause. And so when the bride comes down that middle aisle, the families on each side, it's like the families are coming, recognizing and symbolizing the sacrifices that have been made to get this bride and groom to enter into this covenant. And they're saying this is a pledge that we intend to keep for a lifetime. It's a pledge that we're going to keep to each other, and it's a pledge that we're going to keep to God for our life. And so let's stop right there and say this about marriage. Marriage was designed by God to be a permanent relationship. Marriage was designed by God to be a permanent relationship. Don't try to unone what God has made one. That's in essence what Jesus is saying. What God has joined together, let no man separate. Marriage is to be lifelong. Marriage is to be permanent. And so a marriage begins when God joins a husband and wife, joins two people together. A marriage survives when those two people refuse to give up. That really becomes a lot of the issue right here, doesn't it? Because lots of people make a pledge that they intend to keep for the lifetime. Nobody comes to a wedding ceremony and says, well, we hope to. If it doesn't work out, let me just say most people come intending with all their heart to abide by that covenant that they're making. But obviously that doesn't always end up being the case. In my observation, there's about 3 reasons why those promises aren't kept. One of those that I hear from people is this: we're not in love anymore. We used to be in love, but we're not now, and we just kind of fell out of love. Which is why marriage has to be built on this idea of commitment, not just on feelings of romantic love. Now, obviously, romantic love is important, but the foundation of marriage is a commitment of the will. It's a covenant before God. It's a commitment that holds the couple together through the difficulties of life. Listen, staying married is not about staying in love. We've got this idea in our culture that it's something that you just fall into and you can just as likely fall out of, that it's just an accidental thing. I wasn't looking for it, and then boom, it just hit me over the head, and I fell in love, or then I fell out of love, and that's not love. That's sexual attraction. And sexual attraction is very much a gift from God, but it's not love. Love is intentional. Love is costly. Love is sacrificial. Love is often hard work. And when the Bible speaks of love, it measures it primarily not by how much you receive, but by how much you're willing to give of yourself to someone else. So one of the reasons people talk about is, well, we just fell out of love. Here's a second reason that I find that people cannot seem to fulfill that marriage covenant, and it goes something like this. Well, we found out we're just not a good fit. We thought we were a good fit. We thought, but the more we got to know each other, it just didn't work out. We just weren't a good fit together. They didn't meet my expectations. I thought they were going to be this, but they turned out to be this. And so we have this issue now. And the truth is that no one can meet your expectations. Just impossible. Even the person that might be the most compatible person for you, they cannot meet your expectations. It's impossible. In fact, I think we've got a problem that some industries just perpetuate for us. It's kind of the eHarmony kind of a thing. If you find the most compatible, most perfectly matched mate for you, then you're not going to have any issues. Well, baloney. There's just no perfect person. Nobody can possibly meet all of your expectations. Nobody can meet possibly all of your conditions, which is exactly why we're called to be Christ-like even in our marriage. That means that we show unconditional love. That means we show lots of grace and lots of mercy. That's why we have to extend forgiveness often. In fact, marriage is meant by God to be a lifetime covenant that changes and transforms us by calling on us to serve the person that we're being married to. And so we're to exemplify those very characteristics of Jesus, of love and forgiveness and mercy and grace. And all of those things are things we should expect to give to that person who can never meet our expectations or never meet the conditions and the ideas that we have of that perfect spouse. It's impossible. Another reason that I hear is this one. Well, we just are always fighting. We can't seem to get along. We're always arguing. We just thought it'd be better for everybody, be better for the kids if we just weren't together anymore and cut down on all the conflict. Well, let's make sure that we understand that conflict is a byproduct of being under the same roof. So we got to quit using it as an excuse to split up. Conflict is just inevitable when you live with somebody, and so we've got to figure out how to resolve it. We either need to come up with some kind of resolution to that conflict, resolve that conflict, or we need to decide we're just going to quit fighting about that. And quite honestly, sometimes you get to that point where we know this is something we don't agree upon and we will probably never agree upon, but we're going to choose not to fight about this thing. In fact, there's been some interesting research done by some leading family scholars. It was headed up by a sociologist at the University of Chicago. And they found this interesting in this study. It found that 2/3 of unhappily married spouses, 2/3 of them who stayed married reported that their marriages were happy 5 years later. People that were unhappy found out 5 years later that they were now happily married. Listen to this. 8 out of 10 of the most unhappy marriages. So these are people not just unhappy, they are the most unhappy marriages that exist. 8 out of 10 of them, when they avoided divorce, were happily married 5 years later. They're trying to figure out, how is it that all of these people who were unhappy, majorities of people who somehow just didn't divorce, they stayed married. How did they end up being happy later on? So they did some group interviews with these formerly unhappy husbands and wives and asked them what turned their marriage around. They found 3 distinct things. One of those is, for some, it was just simply marital endurance. They didn't necessarily resolve their issues, they just outlasted them. Just enough time went by that now they're happy. Second reason was marital work. They actively worked at it. They engaged in some solutions. They changed some behaviors. They improved some communication. They worked at it, and so 5 years later, now they're happy. For some, it was personal happiness. While their marriage didn't seem to change, people found alternative ways to make their own happiness instead of depending upon a spouse for their happiness. In other words, they got happy personally, individually, and it affected the happiness of their marriage. Their marriage happiness didn't change, but when they got happy, they found that as a couple, they were happy. So here's kind of some underlying findings. They said this: a strong commitment to marriage as an institution and a powerful reluctance to divorce don't merely keep unhappily married people locked in misery together, they also help couples form happier bonds. They went on to say, to avoid divorce, many assume marriage must become happier. But it is at least equally true that in order to get happier, unhappy couples or spouses must first avoid divorce. In most cases, a strong commitment to staying married not only helps couples avoid divorce, it helps more people achieve a happier marriage. Marriage was designed by God to be a permanent relationship. And when you keep that commitment, that covenant that you've made with your spouse and before God, often what happens is you find yourself in a happy, fulfilling relationship. Now, the context again of what we read in Mark chapter 10 is Jesus being asked very specifically about divorce. Then Jesus launches into this teaching about the permanence of marriage. Let me just real briefly address that idea that for some people, and unfortunately in some church settings, that if you're divorced, then basically life is over and you can never be happy again. That God somehow hates divorced people. Well, the truth is God doesn't like divorce, but those ideas, those concepts are not true. In fact, when you read the Bible through, God has gone through a divorce. It was an unwanted divorce, but His people were unfaithful to Him. It's not what He wanted, but He has gone through that. And if you have walked through a divorce, it's easy in a sermon like this to feel guilty, to feel like there's no hope, I've messed up, I wanted a permanent relationship, but it didn't happen. And I want to assure you that God promises that there is hope and that there is healing and that there is restoration and there is forgiveness after the fact. God's ideal is a permanent relationship, but God forgives all of us. Well, it's Father's Day today, and I'm glad to have my dad here with me. Dad, I want you to come up here with me, and I told you that we were going to visit with Dad just a little bit, and I was going to interview him. And Dad, it's no secret to the Cedar Ridge people here that Harold and I both, in fact, we talk about this often, that we think that you and Mom are the reason why we're in ministry. You guys led that example for us. You and Mom did that, and so thank you for that. And thank you specifically in this context for being an example for us of what a permanent marriage relationship looks like. That was something that you and Mom modeled for us all along. And so we've been talking about that concept today about marriage. And sometimes people think that pastors have perfect families and perfect marriages. They have it all together. There's not ever problems there at all. Were there times in your relationship with Mom that it was hard? It was hard to stay together.
Oh, to be sure, it was just because we're human, for one thing, and because when you get two people together, they have differences of thoughts and opinions and ideas, and so yes, it was. But the thing that helped us so much was that we recognized that, not that because we were in ministry or trying to do something specifically special for God or anything like that. It's just that we recognize that this is, as you've said, what the Bible teaches. And there's going to be struggles. There's going to be those kind of issues that all people go through, differences of opinion. There's going to be struggles over financial matters, for example. There's going to be more than just economic. It's going to be problems that you have with your children and parenting decisions, and they're just all kinds of things that you have to go through. And so it's so important that we recognize that we have a God who goes through that with us, and that we rely upon Him to help us. So I would have to say that what we went through, without getting more specific about all the many things there were, they were items that virtually everyone goes through. They were the kind of issues and struggles that we all go through, right on up to the death of my wife. We all experience a death of loved ones, and those are some of those struggles, probably the most difficult to deal with.
I'll ask you about that in just a minute. But so, what are some of the things that you and Mom did to get through those times together? Are there some things that you specifically worked at, or something you kind of talked about how you lived just knowing that was the reality of it? What did you do to get through those difficult times?
I don't remember us just sitting down and writing out some principles or anything like that, but over time we had a kind of a standard way of handling things. For example, when something come up, we would decide that we need to face this issue, face it squarely, and not do the blame game that we have a tendency to do when there's differences, well, it's your fault or my fault or whatever, but not to do that, and just to realize that these things are common in humanity, and they are certainly common in marriage. And so we would do that, to recognize that first of all, and then seek God's counsel through His Word, through prayer. Sometimes there have been issues that have come up where we've invited someone else, someone that's very mature as a Christian, to help us deal with some kind of a difference that we were having. But nevertheless, sometimes we just had to make sure that we recognize that those times are allowed by God. We need to allow them ourselves because it's a part of our spiritual development and our relationship with God.
Yeah.
So just let those things draw you closer to God. It will happen if we take that attitude.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. That's good, because so often we just get conflict happens and we think, well, we can't continue like this, and
Right.
it's normal.
Yes.
So you mentioned, in fact, I was counting it up. We lost Mom almost 10 years ago. And we've got lots of folks here, friends of mine at church here, that, like you and Mom, were married decades, 40 plus years for you and Mom. And we've got people that have lost a spouse after being married 30, 40, 50, 60 years. What do you tell people, and how did you get through that loss when you've been a part of a permanent, lifelong relationship like that? What would you tell people that are going through that, and what's helped you?
Okay. Just to realize that that time does bring about healing. We've heard that all of our lives, but when we lose someone, we think that doesn't apply to me, but it does. Mm-hmm. And in the very beginning months and years, it is extremely difficult. And you have people that mean well, and they'll come and say something to you, and usually it hurts more than it helps. Like I said, they're well-meaning people, but you just have to recognize they're trying to help and divorce that from the hurt that it causes. Beyond that, if we're Christians, Greg, we just have to look at it and say, hey, we're Christians, and this world is not our home. And what does God require of us before we can go to be with Him forever and ever? And the transition is called death. Mm-hmm. And when we look at death in that way, when we lose someone, we are seeing them promoted. Sometimes I'll say, what I feel is that I've been left behind. Mm-hmm. But I do know that my wife has been promoted to heaven. She's better off. And in a sense, that's what I'm living for too, mm-hmm. is to be translated into God's forever world.
Yep. Good. Mm-hmm. So you've got, I'm not trying to tell on you, but you're 70-something years old. I won't get into specifics.
Okay, good.
You and Mom married 40 plus years. You've been in ministry 50 plus years. You've counseled people that have struggled in marriage. You've done premarital counseling. Then you've gone through the loss of a spouse. On this side of all of that for you, what would you tell husbands and wives that are out there listening? What kind of advice would you give them?
I would say, you love God, don't you? And they're going to say yes. And I say, well, love God during the bad times as well as the good times, because He loves you during the good and the bad. And then I would say, love each other. Love each other. Even though there are times when you don't feel like you love that person as much as you have in the past, still love. Love unconditionally. It's so important that we do that, and you've already mentioned that. And then I would say, do things together. It's very important that husbands and wives do things together. We live in a society where that seems like we're losing some of that, and we need that. Yep. We need that togetherness. And I like the idea of saying, as I have many times, that my wife was my best friend. I have other friends, but my best friend was my wife, and I think every man ought to be able to say that, and every woman ought to be able to say that of her husband as well. But beyond that, compliment each other. Be generous with those compliments. And maybe just kind of wrap it up with this. I believe that every family needs to adopt a no-loser philosophy, a no-loser package, if you please, for your family. Do they make mistakes? I'm talking about husbands and wives, children as well. Do they make mistakes? Yes, every one of them. They make mistakes. But they're not losers.
Yeah.
And if you've got that kind of mentality, if you've got that mentality where you're blaming the rest of their lives, something they did wrong, then that's going to not only hurt them, but it's going to hurt you. So adopt that kind of a no-loser policy in your home, and it'll bring a lot of happiness your way.
Good counsel for us, Dad.
Thank
Happy
you.
Father's Day, Dad. Thanks for being with us today and for sharing your wisdom and counsel with our church. Do you mind just saying a prayer for people in our church that are married and praying that they have that kind of permanent marriage and that they do exactly those things? Would you just mind praying for us right
Be
now?
happy to. Father, we pause here at the close of this message, a message that describes the kind of marriage that you desire, the kind of marriage that you've outlined in your word. And Father, there needs to be permanency in marriages in our country and around the world. We need to see more of that. We need to see, Father, unity among husbands and wives and within the family relationships as well. There's so much need, Father, in our world today, and I thank you that we've been able to just take another look, another peek at what you have taught us about marriage and the home. And I pray that all of us will leave this place taking these things to heart and decide that we're going to do our best to be in a setting, in a home where these relationships are taken seriously and where we put God upon the throne and that each other loves each other, each person loves each other unconditionally as God loves us. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.